long ago that the Messiah would suffer and die and rise from the dead on the third day. It was also written that this message would be proclaimed in the authority of his name to all the nations, beginning in Jerusalem. There is forgiveness of sins for all who repent. You are witnesses of all these things. It's a common claim that's made, isn't it? Whether it's a teenager on a make-believe story about people on an island in the Arctic somewhere who, instead of running away from dragons or trying to kill them, start to train them and ride them, and then he finds this gadget out of it, especially if you're doing a video. Apparently it changes everything. Very fun film to watch, or set of films to watch. Well, I do recommend them, even though they are absolutely ridiculous. They are a fun set of films to watch. But this changes everything. Often advertisers will use that, won't they? That new gadget. If you've got that new gadget, it will change everything. Or that new look, that new wardrobe, that new hairstyle, that new relationship, that new house, that new car, that new location, that new job. It'll change everything. That's the claims, the superlative claims that are often made. Some of them are trivial, some of them are slightly more important. We might even talk about it in terms of big events. We couldn't exactly complain if someone in Ukraine said that in the last 2 months everything has changed for the worse, sadly. But even that doesn't actually change everything. One thing, one event changes everything, and that is the empty tomb. The fact that Jesus was not there, that Jesus is alive. That alone really stands up to that statement. This changes everything. The academic Yaroslav Pelikan said this on his deathbed: if Christ is risen, nothing else matters. And if Christ is not, nothing else matters. Because it's absolute, isn't it? Now you might say that's a bit harsh, surely other things do matter. Well, to a certain extent they do, but remember that in the Bible often things are talked about superlatively. So when Jesus says, love me and hate your family, he doesn't literally mean hate your family. He's just talking about the comparisons. You've got to put God first. So of course other things matter, but not in comparison to the fact that Christ is risen. It is of absolute, ultimate value. Without it, death is a hopeless end. With it, we have an endless hope. It totally does change everything. And of course, we're reminded with Good Friday just a couple of days ago that you need the two. You cannot have the one without the other. If we have Good Friday without the empty tomb, what have we got? We've got a wonderful gesture, a sacrifice. We've got Jesus defeating sin, evil, the devil. We've got judgment averted. But the grave is still the end. Death was only defeated when Christ rose. And of course, we wouldn't want Easter Sunday without Good Friday, would we? We've got a victorious Lord, but one who's going to judge us all. And with no way of us ever measuring up. That's actually quite scary. We need the two together. This really does change everything. And it's not merely, of course, a one-off miracle, the resurrection. It's the pinnacle of God's redeeming work in human history. Right from the beginning, when Adam and Eve sinned and the fall, and you had sin coming to the world, evil coming to the world, death coming to the world, we see through the pages of the Bible God start to redeem. We see the judgment on the world, but then Noah was spared and his family to restart. And then, of course, God calls out one man, Abraham, who was faithful. And through Abraham and his descendants, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, We have a people, one for God, a people of his covenant, a people through whom God would reveal himself to them, but also through them to the world. We have them redeemed from slavery in Egypt and given their own land. And they, of course, we see the work through Moses, through Joshua, who, of course, under them, they defeated their enemies and took possession of that land. We have the judges, who God used, and then the kings, and, of course, all the prophets that were there speaking to the people. But, of course, ultimately, God had to come himself. His son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, came, born as a baby, grew up, lived a true kingdom life, perfect life, died for our sakes and rose again. Pinnacle of all things. Of course, the culmination of it will be when he returns in glory to make all things right. It is of absolute, ultimate significance. It really does change everything. Now, if we go back to the passage that Sue read from at the beginning of Luke 24, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it and some comparisons between the Gospels. There are obviously 4 accounts of the resurrection in each of the 4 Gospels. It does warrant being in all 4, just about, just slightly. So here in Luke's Gospel, we hear that several women went to the tomb. Several. That's at least 5. 3 women are named, and then it says, and then there are other women. At least 5, probably more actually. At around dawn on the Sunday. Now in John's Gospel, it's interesting to note that he only mentions one, Mary Magdalene. Now the reason for John saying that isn't because he's saying, well, Luke's got it wrong and there's a bit of an uncertainty. John accentuates Mary Magdalene for the reason, well, 2 reasons. One, he's interested in the personal relationships. So many things in John are one-to-one, aren't they? Whether it's Jesus and Nicodemus, the woman at the well, etc., etc. But, of course, Mary Magdalene, whether she stayed there when the others went back to tell the male disciples, or whether she went back with them but then joined Peter and actually John, it was Mary, of course, that was the first to see the risen Lord. Not just be able to see that she actually, in John's Gospel, wonderfully, she meets the risen Lord. And that's why John accentuates her specifically. They're not contradicting each other. But there were several women certainly saw that empty tomb. They got there at around dawn on the Sunday. We might assume that they actually left just before dawn, when it was still dark, so that they would get there at first light as quick as possible. They couldn't wait. We might ask, though, why did they wait till Sunday? You could ask that question. Some of you will know the answer to that, some of you won't. On the Friday, of course, Jesus died on the cross in the afternoon. He was then buried in a tomb, in a garden, by a rich man who was a follower of his called Joseph of Arimathea, along with Nicodemus. They did all those things. And then the women were actually watching. They were there, watching where Jesus was put. So they knew where to find him. And then it was around sunset they got out. Because, of course, it was Friday evening. Friday at sunset is the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. The beginning of the last day of the week for the Jews. And it wasn't just any Sabbath. It was Passover Sabbath. Passover, of course, is the reminder that the Jews were saved from slavery in Egypt. So it's a really holy Sabbath at that. So you better get out of the way and not be working if you're a good Jew. So they left. They then could not travel anywhere or do any sort of work on the Saturday until sunset. Then it's dark and you don't really want to be going around there anyway. So they go as soon as they were allowed and as soon as they were able. They are right there doing what they feel they must do. Now the women, of course, had seen that Joseph of Arimathea had rolled a stone across the tomb. They noticed that, surely, and when they all left. And in Mark's Gospel, it actually has this little funny account where the women are saying, who's going to remove the stone? Who's going to do it? None of us can do that. And you think, well, why didn't they ask one of the men to come with them, or a couple of the men? You don't know. Maybe they didn't want to. Maybe it was too early. Maybe they didn't think it was worth it. And the women actually are questioning that. But actually, Matthew's Gospel tells us there's a far bigger obstacle than just the stone in front of the tomb. I'm just going to read briefly from Matthew chapter 28. Verse 65, the Jewish leaders have a request for Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. In verse 65, Matthew 27, verse 65, Pilate replied, "Take guards and secure it the best you can." So they sealed the tomb and posted guards to protect it. Now, guards were there. So actually, the women didn't need to worry about the stone. It doesn't matter if they're going to be able to roll it away, because the guards are going to tell them to get lost. Anyway, there's no way they're going to be allowed in at all, on pain of death, their death and the guards' death, potentially. But Matthew's Gospel also talks about that. It says that the guards fell into a dead faint. Two things happened: an earthquake and, of course, the appearance of these two angels. And we know that when people saw angels in the Bible, they were scared witless. And so those guards were taken out of the picture. In fact, so much out of the picture, so irrelevant, we didn't even bother mentioning them. Because they were there, but they had fainted. So it was as though they weren't. So that was sorted out. And then as the women got to the tomb, of course, they realised there's no stone to move. Oh, that's convenient. And of course, then they go. And you can imagine their sadness, their shock, their horror at seeing it's empty. Who's taken the body? You can imagine, you go to your loved one's gravesite, and the grave's been dug, and the body's not. Can you imagine that? It's always not worth imagining, is it? It's a horrible thought. And later on, Mary Magdalene, who must have doubted something at some point, she actually asks the person who she thinks is the gardener, "Where have you put his body? Please tell me." And of course, wonderfully, it's Jesus himself. It's here, right here. But that was the shock the women have had. It got worse. They want to do Jesus respect. They want to show their love for him. They want to care for him by rubbing ointment on his body and just presenting him, as it were, for the burial again. They want to do something out of devotion and love for him, and they can't even do that. So briefly, they must have absolutely despaired. But then comes the message of hope from the angels, the message of assurance. He told you. He told you. He said it all along. Of course, we can't really complain they didn't believe it. I don't think any of us would have either, to be fair. But why are you searching for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. And go and tell him, guys, that's sitting there, up there in that room. And so they do. They go back and tell the men. Now, one reason why the men probably weren't there was because they're so scared to go as well. The women had the guts to go, actually. And just thinking about the women here, two reasons why the women were chosen to be the first to see the empty tomb. And all four gospel writers agree on it. Firstly, God likes to confound human wisdom, the wisdom of this world. And in those days of patriarchal society, the testimony of women was seen as less valid than men. And God thought, well, I can do what I want. I'm going to make women have this. And okay, it might look less bad, it might not be on the PR scheme, it might not be used as a marketing strategy. I'm sure Kath's company probably wouldn't use that as the marketing strategy, for example. But God knows. God knows, and he wills. And even though it may not be the obvious place to start a global revival, a global phenomenon, God is in control, and he has the power to do it, even against human expectation, what might seem as wise in the eyes of the world. The second reason the women came to the tomb and were the first to see the empty tomb, Mary being the first, we believe, to actually see Jesus himself, is this: they were the most devoted. They weren't they? Who was at the crucifixion? Who was at the crucifixion? Maybe John. You can probably cut the Apostle John a little bit of slack here, but I think even he at first ran off when Jesus was betrayed, when Jesus was arrested. I think even he briefly lost his nerve, but fair play, he didn't come back. But apart from him, and that's slightly arguable, it's the women. The women were the ones who are most faithful, most loyal, most courageous. So I think one of the reasons no men came was they were scared. The women weren't. And so they were chosen to be the ones that saw Jesus. Jesus rewards loyalty. He doesn't reward status. Who had the big status in the early church? Of course, it was people like Peter and James and John and later Paul. But God doesn't look at status, he looks at our heart's devotion to him. And that's a good thing for churches today. He doesn't look at status, he looks at, are we loving Jesus and are we committed to him? Not what's our place in the world needs to know. What is our love? What is the measure of our devotion to him? That's what he looks at. And of course, the men don't believe them. What a surprise. Oh no, that's just nonsense. In a sense, you can have a bit of sympathy. It does sound crazy, doesn't it? You know, you can imagine being there. Possibly, would you be cynical? Maybe. But here we have to give the shamed Peter some credit. Because Peter has messed up more than anyone else, hasn't he? I mentioned it the other day on the high street. Peter really did mess things up, denying Jesus. He didn't just abandon him, he denied him. And Peter must have wondered, if he is risen, what sort of reception am I going to get? I think I might be out of his plans now. In many ways, he deserves to be out of his plans, doesn't he? But fair play to Peter on this. While the others are saying, no, we're not going to bother. Peter at least goes and checks. He may have disbelieved, but he thinks, I'm at least going to go and check. Apparently John went as well, the two of them. So they get a little bit more credence here than the others. And so they go, and of course they see the same thing, the empty tomb. But you know what's dangerous though? Is the doubt. The doubt that was shown by those guys back in the upper room made Mary Magdalene herself doubt what she'd seen and heard. Because instead of listening, remembering what the angels had said about the fact that he's not here, he's risen. He will go ahead of you into Galilee, you will see him, tell the others. She thinks of their doubt, she thinks of their cynicism. They're almost scorning him. You're talking nonsense. And so she's at that place, sadly, even though John and Peter are there and they're wondering what's happening, where she's still saying, where's the body? Tell me where you've laid him. But gloriously, Jesus has mercy on her, doesn't he? And he's right there. Mary. And she was master and grabs him and hugs him. Which is a wonderful thing. But it shows how dangerous cynicism is, doesn't it? It shows how dangerous it is, those who would doubt and mock our faith. And we have to be on our guard. We have to be on our guard. We have to put our spiritual armour, that we might not fall into doubt because others are trying to push us down or to doubt what we believe. We must be very careful with these things. Of course, Mary was wonderfully vindicated, and Peter was fortunate. Luke actually tells us that Jesus appeared specifically to him, no doubt to reassure him that he wasn't persona non grata. And so he comes to the point where the disciples are meeting, they're starting to maybe think he has risen, and then, of course, Jesus meets them in the upper room, and he says that wonderful Hebrew word, shalom, peace be with you. Not just an absence of war and conflict, but a sense of overwhelming security and assurance and well-being. It's far bigger than the English word peace. And that's what he says to them. And here it says, they were scared, they were frightened, they were terrified. Because they imagined he was just a ghost. They know a ghost appears, he comes to haunt us. You know, perhaps because they knew they let him down and abandoned him. Or disbelieved him. And, there were those who thought, well, that's not bad. At least, Jesus shows that there's something ahead. At least we can see this ethereal being here. Maybe there's something off here. But of course, resurrection as a spirit wouldn't have been a real resurrection, would it? That Jesus was physically there. He could touch. Mary had already, of course, touched him. She'd hugged him. Tell us to let him go, hadn't he? And then he says, come on, touch me. Come on. Feel that I am not just something you put your hand through. And then he even eats a piece of fish, again, to show that he is physical. But you know what? Jesus' body wasn't just physical. It wasn't just physical. It was more than physical. More than physical. Because he seemed to be able to walk through walls. The doors were locked. He seemed to be able to appear where he chose. And the mind bubbles, doesn't it? But what a promise. What an inheritance. Because he is the first fruits of the resurrection to eternal life. A promise that we all have ourselves. That these bodies, which we might call not spirit bodies, but spiritual bodies, where there is a physicality to them, but there's something far, far better. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says this, verses 42 and 43. It is the same way with the resurrection of the dead. Our earthly bodies are planted in the ground when we die, but they will be raised to life forever. Our bodies are buried in brokenness, but they will be raised in glory. They are buried in weakness, but they will be raised in strength. And verse 53. For our dying bodies must be transformed into bodies that will never die. Our mortal bodies must be transformed into immortal bodies. And that is the inheritance that's laid up for us. That's what we have in store, because Christ died for our sins and raised to new life that death might be defeated. You know, I saw Connie in hospital yesterday, visited her. Her body's almost given up. Her mind as well, I would suggest, too. You know, our bodies, these physical bodies, will wear out. They will die. They will recede. But the glorious inheritance we have is something far, far better. It will not wear out. It is immortal. They will not degrade. They will not age or malfunction or stop function. It's something that will be endless because it's the perfection that Christ has got in store for us. I go to prepare a place for you, he said. And it's wonderful to think. And it's also glorious in his presence there'll be no more suffering or sickness or crying or mourning or death or pain or sin. And that's what Christ has in store for us because he died and he rose again. And what does Jesus say to his followers at the end? He says, go into all the world and say this, there is forgiveness of sins for all who repent. You are witnesses of all these things. I know we are not physically witnesses. We have a testimony of what Christ has done for us. So in a sense we are all witnesses as well, even 2,000 years later. And we can all give that message of forgiveness of sins for all who repent. And the good news that Jesus is not dead, he's not in a tomb, he's risen, and he is alive. And let's go with that message. Let's live that message, let's trust that message, and make that message impact our lives always. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. And let's repeat that other acclamation. Alleluia, Christ is risen.
Yes,
it is. Alleluia. Happy Easter, maybe.
Happy Easter.